Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Hugo, my son, just turned 1. Let's sit down and talk about my breastfeeding journey. I think there's so much information I want to get out to you and so much that I want to say about such a sensitive subject, and breastfeeding for sure. I mean, a lot of you guys know from watching my vlogs and my postpartum updates, breastfeeding was really hard for me and I didn't enjoy it. I didn't walk away from the entire experience thinking like that was magical. I actually really hated breastfeeding, to be honest. And it was my very early introduction to like mommy shaming, judgment, mommy guilt. That was a huge one. The feelings of despair and hopelessness, but also the hand-in-hand feelings of like euphoria and ecstasy. So I feel like breastfeeding, especially right after you have given birth, gone through labor and delivery, is one of those very subjective experiences, but still one that connects us to other fellow mothers. I thought I would rewind a little bit in case you're new to my channel and tell you a little bit about like the beginning of our breastfeeding journey. I'll say that my aunt is a lactation consultant and my best friend is a doula, both of whom were there when I gave childbirth. So I felt like I had a really great team, and I still feel that way. I had a really great birthing team and everyone that was there was so supportive. I always thought like, yeah, of course I'm gonna breastfeed. I'm gonna breastfeed my baby. It always looked really easy, like in the movies and on TV, and even the other women in my life who I had seen breastfeeding, it looked easy enough. I also never had anyone in my life say to me, breastfeeding is really hard. And hopefully, spoiler, I can be that person for you in case you are pregnant or you don't have anyone in your life, in your family or friend circle who have breastfed before or who have talked about it. Breastfeeding is very hard and it is very deceiving. It looks deceivingly easy, it is not. So anyway, I was quite naive as a first-time mom, thinking like, okay, like it looks easy, it looks like a piece of cake. Labor, delivery, knew that was gonna be hard, breastfeeding looked easy. So had my son that night, tried latching, and I thought that I had him latching on pretty well throughout the night. I was up every 2 hours, more like 90 minutes feeding him. And then the next day, I remember I had sort of started just feeding him exclusively on the right side because I felt like he was latching on better. Now, I had no idea, latching, not latching. Luckily, my aunt came the next day. So she was there for labor and delivery. I gave birth at night. She went home. She came back the next day and she then saw that you actually have flat nipples, which again, how would you know? How would you know that the shape and size of your nipple can really impact how your baby latches on? And so she explained to me I had flat nipples. That meant that the baby was having a hard time pulling the nipple out and that I was gonna need some assistance. Great. So we went on the hunt for extra small Medela nipple guards, or nipple shields, I should say. And at the same time, she brought out a pump. A hospital grade pump for me, because what ended up happening was Hugo wasn't latching properly on my right side, and my right side by the morning time was super chafed and was starting to crack. And so then I started feeding him exclusively off my left side while I pumped on the right side. So by about the second day in the hospital, my right side was really sore, cracked, bleeding, like the whole 9 yards. I was putting nipple cream on it, just pumping on my right side, and pumping didn't bother it, funny enough. So I was using the nipple shield. The nipple shield was doing a really great job at pulling my nipple out. Baby was feeding, everything was fine. So I thought, okay, like this is definitely a bump in the road, but not something I can't tackle. So of course your hormones are on an all-time high after you give birth, and there's the adjustment period of, oh my gosh, now I am a mother and I have to take care of and I'm responsible for this little life, all the while taking care of yourself. I had a pretty traumatic vaginal birth. I ended up with an episiotomy, a 4th degree tear, which meant that, I think it's called your perineum, totally tore open and continued to tear. I ended up with a 4th degree tear, rectal tear, so that tear continued. I had a lot of stitches. And the recovery process was so painful and so difficult. I was so lucky because I was at the time living at home with my parents. My husband and I were sort of shacked up with them, and that was a godsend because my mom and husband, my whole family, just were there 100% to take care of me. But I remember thinking, this is insane. How am I supposed to take care of this baby but take care of myself at the same time? And then on top of everything else, recovery from the pain of childbirth and the pain of all these stitches. Oh my gosh, breastfeeding is so painful. Breastfeeding is so painful. And everyone kept saying, if it's painful, you're not doing it right. If it's painful, the baby's not latching on right. But I was using the nipple shields, and what they don't tell you is that your nipples have to get used to the baby sucking at them. So it's sort of like when you buy a brand new pair of shoes and you have to break them in a little bit. I mean, some shoes are going to be more uncomfortable than others, but regardless, you have to break them in. So I had to break my nipples in, and that was really painful. It was pretty painful for the first maybe like 2 or 3 minutes of breastfeeding, and then normally it would go away, unless of course he wasn't latched properly. And then I was being told that also the nipple shields weren't a permanent solution to my flat nipples, and that ideally we should have baby learn how to pull my nipple out on his own. But every time I would take the nipple shield off and have Hugo latch on, it was so insanely painful. And it wasn't painful to my nipple, and that was the weirdest thing. It was actually really painful, like right underneath. It almost felt like muscularly painful, like some sort of muscle was being hurt by his latch. It was the most bizarre thing. We got him checked for tongue ties, lip ties, and everything came back totally clear. So I resolved in my head to like, okay, I'll just use the nipple shields. And at that point, like still recovering those first few months, I have no body shame, like nothing. Like I am just totally free. I'm in those mesh hospital underwear all the time, usually not even wearing a bra, just like letting my boobs be out. And I think that actually really helped with the recovery process of my nipples and drying them out and avoiding like further cracking down the road. Exclusively breastfeeding for those first few months, and I could just tell from the beginning that I didn't love it. Like I was never having that magical moment where I felt this like insane, intense bond with baby. And I felt up the bond with him in other ways, like when he'd be sleeping on me, when we'd be sleeping together, or if I were taking him for a walk, dressing him. It was like almost every other activity I felt that like insane, beautiful bond. But breastfeeding just felt like such a chore. I didn't enjoy it at all. And I think it had a lot to do with like sensory. I have never been, and this is like so TMI, but like I've never been like a nipple stimulation person. I don't like the feeling. I have very sensitive nipples, and it's just never felt good to me. So I kind of knew before I gave birth, I was like, there's no way that like having a baby latched onto my nipple is going to like feel good to me under any circumstance. There was no point where Hugo was latched on where I felt like, okay, like this doesn't bother me. It just always, sensory wise, just didn't sit right. It never felt comfortable. There was a point where it stopped hurting, but it just never felt comfortable. I also hated the feeling of my milk coming in. I don't know why. Again, it's a sensory thing. Just that feeling of engorgement, that feeling like right before your milk came in, just felt so uncomfortable, and I hated it. And then that feeling of like your milk has come in, your boobs are rock hard, and there's like that intense pressure, that too I hated. I found that I had a pretty low supply to start with, and I would pump in between breastfeeding. But then something that really frustrated me during the entire breastfeeding process, it's like a little bit of a rant, is that people would say pump to increase your supply. Well, I found that all of my supply was going to my baby when he was feeding. Then when he was done feeding, I had nothing left. So I couldn't pump to increase the storage my breast milk storage in the refrigerator freezer. I couldn't pump to increase my milk because there was nothing there. And so I would pump in between, but then I also felt like all I'm doing is either feeding him or pumping, feeding him or pumping. And that was it. And I never found that pumping helped increase my supply at all, to be 1000% honest with you. If anything, I felt like I was just pumping a dry supply. like it was just pulling at nothing. It was around 4 or 5 months where Hugo's relationship with my right boob just like completely changed. He always, like, it was weird. He latched on to my right side, but it was sort of like what came first, the chicken or the egg. Like I wasn't sure if my boob wasn't producing as much milk on the right side because I noticed that he had a preference for my left side. And when your baby is hungry and screaming and crying, the last thing you want to do is latch them on to a side that is not producing any milk. And I totally understand that me just feeding him off my left side didn't do me any favors on my right side. So that whole like mess of a situation, what ended up happening was right side wasn't producing enough milk. In those times of panic where Hugo was hungry, I just like couldn't deal with, I didn't have time for patience for my right boob. I started just feeding him off my left, and my left side was producing enough milk for him so that he would be full after feeding. And I did try pumping on my right side to just keep them even and keep my boobs even, because I did notice an insane difference aesthetically in what my boobs started looking like, but I didn't have patience for it anymore, and I was done. So we stopped feeding off my right side. I was exclusively feeding off my left. And it was around that time too where I started feeling like I wanted to introduce formula to Hugo. And my whole family, minus like 1 or 2 people, are vegan. So imagine wanting to introduce cow's milk to a baby in a vegan family. But that was my first real lesson as a mom, to like stand up for what I felt like was right. And they do make soy-based milks and they do make non-dairy formula options, but 1, they're super expensive, and 2, I found that Hugo enjoyed, I was feeding him Similac Pro Advanced. He enjoyed it. And so I kind of put my foot down and I was like, you know what? Not only do I feel like I'm done with breastfeeding, whoa, but I also am going to start formula feeding this kid. And the amount of guilt, I mean, I still feel guilt about it because of the environment that I'm in, the people who I'm surrounded with. And this isn't to like place a bunch of blame on them or to like make them feel bad about my experience, because I think every experience is a learning experience, especially when you're a new mom. But that was my time to be like, this is the decision I'm making. You don't have to agree with it, but this is not your kid. And also the biggest thing for me was, you are not waking up with this baby in the middle of the night. If you are waking up with this baby every 2 hours in the middle of the night, because Hugo, until he was about 8 months old, did not sleep through the night. He was up every 90 minutes to 2 hours. And the only thing that would get him to fall back to sleep was nursing. And so like I knew I was gonna cut out nursing altogether, but I knew that I wanted to start supplementing, because the joy I got, the joy I felt feeding him formula in a bottle, knowing exactly, and this is like my type A personality, knowing exactly how much formula he was getting, because I didn't know exactly how much breast milk he was getting, knowing exactly how much formula he was getting, knowing that he was full after, was like this immense weight taken off my shoulders, immense. And I just felt so much lighter after that decision. And that was a huge catalyst for my strength and like being able to be like, no, like, again, you're not getting up in the middle of the night with my baby. And if you were, then totally you can make that choice or like make the choice with me. But the fact that I'm the only one getting up in the middle of the night feeding him means that I'm the one who gets to make this choice. And of course, I sat down with my husband about it. We talked about it, and my husband has always been super supportive. So yeah, that was a huge, those were like the big turning points for me going from breastfeeding to formula feeding. And I felt so much more like mental clarity once I switched over to formula, and then had made this like decision in my own head, like, okay, you know what, I'll keep breastfeeding him until I'll do the breastfeeding before naps, breastfeeding before bed, breastfeeding in the middle of the night thing until he's ready to give that up. And that was kind of my compromise, because I was still feeling really guilty about giving him formula. That was my compromise between formula feeding and breastfeeding. So randomly, like so insanely randomly, and keep in mind, like up until the 8-month mark, Hugo had never really slept through the night, and he had always needed the boob to go to bed. Randomly, when he was around 8 months old, he was breastfeeding, and then I saw it in his face. He just kind of like turned away from my boob at one point and started staring at the ceiling, and then he just fell asleep. It was for a nap, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, this is the first time he has fallen asleep on his own without breastfeeding to sleep. So I didn't get too excited, because the thought of like never breastfeeding again was like so exciting to me, but I didn't want to get my hopes up. So the next day, I think like that evening before bedtime, like he breastfed to sleep. Then the next day he did the same thing. And I was like, okay, this is really interesting. Like he is pulling away before he falls asleep and then falling asleep on his own. Then not shortly thereafter, he made, and I think most of this has to do with like the brain development and him getting just like older and taking in more information and thus like being more tired. Anyway, I remember him looking, I put the nipple shield on, and him looking at my boob and looking at the nipple shield. And at this point he had like 2 teeth, and I was really scared that he was gonna bite me. But he like started to sort of breastfeed, but then he kind of pulled away and he looked at the nipple shield as if to be like, what is this? Like he realized for the first time, wait a minute, there's something on your nipple. Like that's not part of your body. What is that? Like what have I been sucking on? What is that? And that moment onward, he stopped breastfeeding. Like it was 1000% his choice. He just decided that like he wasn't into it anymore. It was the most bizarre thing, but I completely saw it in his face. And that night, after he had his bottle, because at that point we were giving him, like I was breastfeeding him to sleep, but I wasn't producing a lot of milk because we were giving him formula every 4 hours, pretty like regularly on a schedule. So that night after I gave him his bottle, I just laid him down next to me, because we have been bed sharing, and I laid him down next to me and he just fell asleep. And so that was so incredible and such a huge developmental milestone, because at that point too, he then started sleeping through the night. So it was almost like our whole world and everything we knew, like the day he was born, got completely changed and flipped around and flipped on its head. We went from having a baby who did not sleep through the night, was up every 2 hours, was like constantly on my boob, needed my boob for everything, to one that like was then good and independent. And it was so interesting. And it's sort of like, I can't talk about his sleeping patterns, I can't talk about formula, I can't talk about any of this stuff without talking about my breastfeeding journey. Like they're so intertwined. I was really happy when I was done breastfeeding. Like that day onward, like started like this new joy in me. I can't say that I look back and ever think like, oh, it wasn't that bad. Like it was really hard. Breastfeeding was really hard. I ended up, so like after we stopped breastfeeding, it took about 2 weeks, I would say, for my milk to go completely away. And those first few days, I was really engorged on my left side, leaking. But after like a week or 2, it was gone completely. Luckily, I never had mastitis, never had any sort of, oh, sorry, one of my eyelashes is. Luckily, I never had mastitis. I never had any sort of a clogged duct issues, never had any infections. But just the whole process, the whole thing was never enjoyable to me. And I did it because I felt guilty, and I felt like that was the right thing to do. Like breastfeeding was the right thing to do. To be honest, like the right thing to do was to follow my instincts and make the right decision that I felt like was the right decision in my heart. And if anything, I wish I would have started formula feeding him earlier, because I think that would have made me feel a little more in control of my life at that point and our schedule. And like we had dabbled with formula here and there. I think he was around like 2 months the first time I gave him formula, but then I stopped, and like it was very like touch and go. It never was consistent until that like 5.5 mark, when we started giving him formula consistently. But I just like it probably wouldn't have helped with his sleep. It probably wouldn't have helped with like, but regardless of that stuff, it would have helped with my mental health and my sanity, and maybe would have made me a better mom, because there were so many times where I just like broke down because of breastfeeding. So the point of all of this is not to scare you, is not to ostracize those who enjoy or love breastfeeding, because obviously I have family members who have made careers out of breastfeeding and helping women breastfeed, and I think it is such a beautiful thing. But I wanted to share my story, because if you are part of the group of women who didn't enjoy breastfeeding or didn't like it and feel alone in that, I want you to know that like you're not alone. That like I totally hated breastfeeding, still hate it, and am like totally the black sheep of the family in that regard. In terms of like breastfeeding my next baby, I don't know, and I'm not like, I'm gonna leave that for like next baby. I'm not going to try to make a decision about that now, because who knows, I could have the same experience, I could have a different experience. If motherhood has taught me anything, it's that you just never know, and so we'll see. Okay guys, finally got it out there. That is my breastfeeding story. I don't think I forgot anything. If you have any questions or want anything clarified, let me know down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching and for your support. I love you all, and I'll talk to you on my next one.